In the grey hush of early Dublin, the streets remember. The stones underfoot still carry the sound of footsteps long gone, the voices of those who lived, dreamed, and suffered here. Among them, one voice rose above the rest, not in loud proclamations, but in the quiet intensity of words that would redefine literature. This is the story of James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, a man who left his city to find his voice, yet carried its spirit wherever he went. In his work, Dublin breathes, even in exile. In his silence, entire worlds speak. This film will journey through his life, his works, his obsessions, and the still moments that echo louder than any shout. James Joyce was born on February 2, 1882, in Rathgar, a suburb of Dublin, the eldest of 10 surviving children in a family that knew both comfort and hardship. His father, John Stanislaus Joyce, came from Cork with a sharp wit, a fine tenor voice, and an unshakable belief in his own social charm. His mother, Mary Jane Murray, was a devout Catholic whose quiet patience would be tested by her husband's declining fortunes. The Joyce's early years in Bray were marked by stability, but as his father's finance crumbled, the family moved through a series of ever smaller homes. This shifting ground from respectability to near poverty would give young James an acute awareness of class, ambition, and the fragile nature of security. Even as a child, he observed keenly. The streets of Dublin were not just scenery. They were living characters, each with their own rhythms and secrets. They would one day find their way into his fiction, not as vague impressions, but as precisely drawn portraits of place. Joyce began his education at Clongowes Wood College, a Jesuit boarding school, where he excelled academically but struggled with the strict Catholic discipline. After his father's financial troubles forced him to leave, he attended Belvedere College, another Jesuit institution, and finally University College Dublin, where his mind began to truly awaken. It was here that Joyce discovered Henrik Ibsen, whose plays challenged moral conventions, Dante Alighieri, whose epic verse revealed the beauty of language, and Thomas Aquinas, whose philosophy sparked debates about faith and reason. These influences would fuel a growing conviction that art should be free from the control of church, state, and public opinion. Joyce's years in education were not merely a progression through schools. They were a crucible where ideas, pressures, and conflicting influences collided to shape one of the boldest literary voices of the 20th century. At Clongowes Wood College, the Jesuit emphasis on rigorous intellectual discipline instilled in him a lifelong respect for logic, structure, and argument. Yet alongside this training came an equally deep resistance. The Catholic Church's strict codes of morality often clashed with the young Joyce's emerging curiosity about the world. In school corridors and classrooms, he felt the heavy hand of authority, priests demanding obedience, doctrines insisting on certainty, and in response, Joyce began developing the restless skepticism that would characterize his art. At Belvedere College, this tension intensified. He excelled in languages, rhetoric, and debate, but his sharpness made him a disruptive force in a culture that valued conformity. Stories of his time there suggest that Joyce could recite vast passages of Latin poetry with dazzling accuracy. Yet he would follow such displays with biting critiques of the very traditions that demanded such memorization. Friends and teachers alike remarked on his contradictions, brilliant yet rebellious, deeply intellectual yet increasingly irreverent, toward established institutions. By the time Joyce entered University College Dublin, he was no longer content to be a passive recipient of knowledge. The city itself became an extension of his classroom. He wandered through Dublin's streets from crowded pubs to the quiet banks of the Liffey, observing the subtleties of speech, gesture, and class. In university lectures, he devoured the writings of Henrik Ibsen, whose uncompromising plays revealed the hypocrisies of modern life. Ibsen's daring themes, truth-telling, social rebellion, the individual against society, resonated so strongly with Joyce that he wrote an impassioned essay in his defense, declaring that literature must not bow to the demands of morality or tradition. Equally important was his encounter with Dante's Divine Comedy, which revealed to him how language could capture both the spiritual and the sensual. Dante's mastery of allegory and structure left a permanent imprint. Joyce would later emulate Dante's layering of meanings, weaving myth, theology, and everyday speech into the same textual fabric. In contrast, the philosophy of Thomas Aquinas challenged him to grapple with reason, theology, and the rational underpinnings of faith. Joyce admired Aquinas' intellect but resisted his conclusions, fueling his conviction that the questions of existence and morality could not be answered by doctrine alone. They had to be explored through art. It was during these years that Joyce began writing seriously. His poetry, often youthful in style, nonetheless revealed a startling intensity. His essays, published in student magazines, displayed a critical mind unafraid to attack revered authorities. When most of his peers sought respectable careers in law, medicine, or the clergy, Joyce envisioned himself as an outsider, a writer who would confront uncomfortable truths, regardless of public opinion. He developed the belief that art must remain independent, not a servant of church, state, or commercial approval, but a sovereign force in its own right. This growing defiance gave him not just an education, but a new identity. Dublin was both his subject and his proving ground. He studied its people, priests whispering confessions, merchants bargaining in markets, young lovers walking by the canal, with the precision of an anthropologist and the sensitivity of a poet. Every word, every gesture seemed to him a clue to the hidden structures of society. Later, these impressions would explode into the detailed realism of Dubliners and the daring experimentation of Ulysses. But at this stage, what mattered most was that Joyce was already rehearsing the role he would play for the rest of his life. The role of an artist in opposition, uncompromising in vision, unsparing in critique, and unyielding in the pursuit of truth. He began writing poetry and critical essays, some of which were published in student magazines. Even then, he was known for his penetrating intellect, his sharp tongue, and his refusal to compromise his artistic principles. Joyce's years in Dublin gave him not just an education, but a defiant artistic identity. In June 1904, Joyce met Nora Barnacle, a young woman from Galway working as a chambermaid. Their meeting was the beginning of a lifelong partnership, passionate, stormy, and fiercely independent. Just months later, they left Ireland together, beginning an exile that would last the rest of Joyce's life. They settled first in continental Europe, moving between Trieste, Zurich, and Paris. Joyce taught English, struggled financially, and wrote with relentless discipline. Though physically distant, he returned to Dublin endlessly in his imagination, walking its streets in memory, capturing its voices in notebooks. This exile was not an escape alone, it was an artistic necessity. Distance allowed him to see Dublin not with the eye of a resident, but with the clarity of an observer, turning familiar places into immortal literature. Nora was unlike anyone Joyce had ever known. Practical, earthy, and unpretentious, she stood in sharp contrast to the rarefied academic world he inhabited. Born into a working class family, she carried none of the airs or inhibitions of Dublin's intellectual elite. Their first walk together on June 16, 1904, became the most famous date in modern literary history. Years later, Joyce would transform it into the single day on which Ulysses unfolds, layering the narrative of his fictional Dubliners over the memory of his first romantic adventure with Nora. To commemorate this fusion of life and art, admirers around the world now celebrate Bloomsday each year, retracing the steps of Joyce's characters across Dublin. Yet beyond literary myth, their partnership was rooted in something more human and essential. Joyce found in Nora a figure of stability amid the chaos of his imagination. She was grounded, witty, and unwavering in her affection, qualities that balanced his volatility, self-doubt, and chronic financial anxieties. While Joyce poured his energies into reimagining the structures of literature, Nora attended to the practicalities of daily life, raising their children, managing their homes, and supporting him even when his ambitions seemed destined to fail. To many of Joyce's friends and contemporaries, their union seemed mismatched, the genius writer and the uneducated chambermaid. But the truth was that their differences created a deep complementarity. Nora provided the rootedness Joyce required, while Joyce gave her a life filled with intensity, adventure, and enduring significance. Their decision to leave Ireland together was bold, even scandalous. In a society where cohabitation outside of marriage was condemned by both church and community, Joyce and Nora defied expectations. They departed Dublin in October 1904, not as a married couple but as two companions determined to fashion their own path abroad. For Joyce, this act of departure was as symbolic as it was practical. Exile was not simply a change of address, it was a deliberate rejection of the suffocating structures of Irish life, the censoring hand of the Catholic Church, the conservatism of his peers, the paralysis he saw in Dublin's social and political life. By leaving, Joyce placed himself in the position of both insider and outsider, forever connected to his homeland, yet distanced enough to scrutinize it with unflinching honesty. Their years in Trieste, Zurich, and Paris were marked by constant upheaval. Joyce often struggled to earn enough money to support his family, resorting to teaching English, borrowing from friends, and living on the edge of poverty. At times, his determination to prioritize writing above all else placed immense strain on their household. Yet Nora's patience and humor helped sustain them through these lean years. Even as Joyce worked obsessively on manuscripts that few publishers dared touch, Nora insisted on the rhythms of ordinary life: meals, laughter, the raising of their children Giorgio and Lucia. For her, love was not an abstraction or a grand literary theme. It was expressed in the small acts of endurance and care that allowed Joyce's genius to flourish. Their eventual marriage in 1931, long after they had built a life together, symbolized not a concession to social convention, but a recognition of their enduring bond. By then, They had weathered decades of hardship, triumph, and controversy. Their union had survived not only external judgment but also the storms of Joyce's own personality. His perfectionism, his fits of despair, and his relentless artistic demands. To the end of his life, Joyce relied on Nora as his confidant, his critic, and his anchor. For Joyce, exile deepened his art. The paradox of his creativity was that he had to leave Dublin to recreate it with unmatched fidelity. From the cafes of Trieste, the quiet streets of Zurich, and the bohemian circles of Paris, he conjured Dublin's voices, its rhythms, its very soul. In the bars and back streets of his memory, he preserved the texture of a city that, though distant, remained ever present in his imagination. Exile sharpened his vision. Ireland became not a place of daily life but a mythic landscape to be mapped in words. He once remarked, "For myself, I always write about Dublin, because if I can get to the heart of Dublin, I can get to the heart of all the cities of the world. In the particular is contained the universal." This conviction, born in exile, shaped every line of his fiction. Thus, Nora Barnacle and the Act of Departure in 1904 are more than biographical details. They represent the dual forces that defined Joyce's life and work, the grounding presence of love and the liberating perspective of exile. Without Nora, his art might have remained unmoored, consumed by its own brilliance. Without exile, his imagination might have remained trapped by the parochialism he despised. Together, they gave Joyce the tools to create literature that was both deeply personal and universally resonant. James Joyce's literary journey can be traced through 4 towering works, each one marking a new frontier in the art of fiction. His earliest masterpiece, Dubliners, published in 1914, appears at first to be a modest collection of short stories about ordinary life in his native city. Yet beneath its plain surface lies a sharp critique of paralysis, Joyce's term for the moral and spiritual stagnation he saw around him in early 20th century Dublin. In these stories, shopgirls, priests, children, and failed lovers confront moments of sudden clarity, what Joyce called epiphanies. One of the most haunting of these is Evelyn. Here we meet a young woman standing on the brink of escape, torn between her oppressive life in Dublin and the promise of a new beginning abroad with her lover. Joyce does not judge her choice. Instead, he captures her suffocating hesitation in a moment of frozen time. The final image, Evelyn clinging to the pier, unable to move, is one of modern literature's most unforgettable portraits of fear, duty, and lost possibility. Through Evelyn, Joyce shows how the invisible chains of family, religion, and tradition can bind even the deepest desires for freedom. The closing tale, The Dead, then elevates this local canvas into something universal, confronting love, memory, and mortality in prose that is at once simple and deeply lyrical. With Dubliners, Joyce gave modern literature one of its clearest mirrors, a city reflected with all its great beauty and broken dreams. But Joyce was never content to remain within familiar boundaries. His next work, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916, turned to the form of the novel and to a subject closer to himself. It is the story of Stephen Dedalus, a thinly veiled self-portrait growing from a sensitive child into a rebellious artist determined to fly by those nets of religion, family, and nation. Joyce reinvented narrative style here. The language of the novel matures alongside Stephen himself, moving from the simple sensory impressions of childhood to the complex interior reflections of adulthood. In doing so, Joyce created a modernist Bildungsroman that traced not just a life, but the growth of consciousness itself. Portrait is both an intimate confession and a declaration of artistic independence. The moment when Joyce positioned himself as a writer who would answer to no authority but his own vision. This boldness found its fullest flowering in Joyce's most celebrated and notorious novel, Ulysses, published in 1922. Set on a single day, June 16, 1904, in Dublin, Ulysses follows the wanderings of three characters, Leopold Bloom, his wife Molly, and Stephen Dedalus. On the surface, the events are ordinary, a funeral, a conversation in a pub, an evening at home. Yet Joyce mapped these episodes onto Homer's Odyssey, transforming Dublin into a modern Ithaca and Bloom into a modern Odysseus. The brilliance of Ulysses lies not just in its structure, but in its daring experimentation with style. Each chapter bends language into new shapes, from newspaper headlines to drunken hallucinations, from catechism-like questions to stream of consciousness monologues. The novel was banned for obscenity in several countries, but for those who persevered, it revealed a vast democratic vision, the epic not of kings and warriors, but of ordinary men and women, their thoughts, their desires, their intimate human struggles. With Ulysses, Joyce expanded the possibilities of what a novel could be, shaping the course of modern literature. And yet, even Ulysses was not the final frontier. Joyce spent the last 17 years of his life writing Finnegan's Wake, 1939, a book that remains one of the most enigmatic works in the English language. If Ulysses captured the waking day, Finnegan's Wake plunges into the dream world of night. Its language dissolves into a river of puns, multilingual jokes, fragments of myth, and half-remembered songs. Characters shift identities, stories loop back on themselves, and the very boundaries of meaning blur. For some, the book is impenetrable. For others, it is a treasure chest of linguistic play, a vision of history and humanity as a vast cyclical dream. Joyce himself once quipped that it would keep scholars busy for centuries. And indeed, nearly a century later, readers are still decoding its riddles. His works remain challenging, sometimes baffling, but always alive, demanding that readers listen not just with their eyes, but with their whole imagination. Joyce spent his later years moving between Paris and Zurich, his eyesight failing, his fame growing. He endured personal losses, including the death of his beloved daughter Lucia's mental health to schizophrenia. In January 1941, at the age of 58, Joyce died in Zurich after surgery for a perforated ulcer. Though he never returned to live in Dublin, his city never left his pages. Today, Bloomsday, June 16th, is celebrated around the world, with readers retracing the steps of Ulysses across Dublin. His work continues to inspire, challenge, and divide, proving that literature's greatest achievements are rarely its easiest. In exile, Joyce found his voice. In silence, he spoke to the world. His Dublin is both gone and eternal, a city rebuilt each time a reader turns his pages. For James Joyce, writing was not merely expression, it was resurrection. His words remain, waiting for the next voice to read them aloud, and for the next pair of eyes to see the city in their mind's eye. History, Joyce once wrote, is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake. Through his work, he left us a map, not out of the nightmare, but deeper into its dream, where truth waits in the shadows and silence says everything.
Have you ever heard of James Joyce?
Yes, I have.
Do you like his work?
Yes, I like it. Even though sometimes it is hard to understand his writings, still when I read a little bit of his work, I feel like he understands what human thinks inside. His writing shows us real human feelings, for example, love, fear, or loneliness. That's why I think it is important to read his books.
Do you believe reading Joyce can change the way we look at life or the world?
Yes, I definitely think so. Reading James Joyce really does change your view on how you perceive life. For example, Joyce doesn't just say a story, he forces you to kind of notice the small details of your everyday life. For example, when you're walking down a street, or when you hear a sound, or maybe someone else's random thoughts, he just forces you to look into these small details. Joyce doesn't just tell us a plot. He forces you to remember what is happening around you and look at your everyday life differently. It also kind of teaches you patience because Joyce's writings are very difficult at first, but when you start to push through and kind of get into it, you know how life works, how human mind works, how emotions work.
What do you mostly like about Joyce?
So James Joyce, I think he is an interesting character. When he met Nora Barnacle and the love life of theirs, I find that very interesting. He was very ambitious, but in the first few years he failed and struggled. Uh, he was basically in poverty line, but Nora supported him, and I think that the characters they were and the love life they had, that was very interesting. And nowadays people celebrate Bloomsday, which shows that people still find interest about their life, and that is a very interesting part to me. So I think that's the thing I like most about James Joyce.
If you had to describe James Joyce in one word, what would it be?
Well, I think James Joyce is not just a writer, but he is a revolutionary. He completed the change the novel was written traditionally. Instead, he applied his own techniques like stream of consciousness, experimenting language, and so on.
So, if James Joyce were alive today, what question would you ask him?
If James Joyce was alive today, at first I would ask him about his writing process, how he managed to cover all of these intricate details in his writing Ulysses, whether it was natural or did he plan it out. That would be my first question. And further on, I would ask him about his characters, were all of them based on his own life? Or did he ever think how would they feel if they knew that they were in his writing? And finally, I would ask him when he wrote those things, was he focusing on only himself and his own time, or did he thought about the future readers?
I have interviewed many people for this documentary, and through this process, I have learned a lot about James Joyce. I feel that I should share my thoughts because there are things that I might never have known if I hadn't made this documentary. For example, I learned that Joyce loved language and sometimes mixed them in his writing. Almost became a teacher before he decided to focus completely on writing. I also found that he liked puzzles and hidden meanings in his books, which makes reading his work like solving a puzzle in a game. I realized that how much he actually cared about the play because in his books he wrote about the streets, shops, and everyday life in the city in a very detailed way. He also used something called stream of consciousness, which shows what people are thinking in their minds. And truly, making this documentary helped me see that Joyce was not just a writer, and but he was also very creative thinker. He played with words, ideas, and stories in a ways most of us would never notice. These are things I probably would not have known if I hadn't studied about his life or about him and closely worked for his documentary. And that's why I feel it's important to share these insights. Thank you.